this lesson, we compiled all the quotes we've received and narrowed down the list of suppliers to a handful that we think would be a good fit for the product that we're sourcing. The reason we want to do this first is we don't want to order samples from all these different factories if they're ultimately not going to work out for us. Once you've decided you want to order a sample from this factory, simply reach out to them and let them know you'd like to order one. Paying for the samples and shipping is very common. It's likely they'll ask you to pay for it. Unless you're in China, then it's more likely you'll get your sample for free since they can ship it domestically. Typically, they'll say the sample's free, but you have to pay for shipping, which usually works out to be about $50 or $100, sometimes even $150. I wouldn't recommend to negotiate sample costs too much. It's typical to have to pay for these, and keep in mind that the factory is not really making any money off of this. It does actually cost quite a bit to ship a sample from Asia over to the US or Europe or wherever you're from, so expect to have to pay for that. What you can ask is to credit the cost of the sample to your initial shipment if you decide to go with them. This is fairly common. As far as paying for the sample goes, I would recommend either paying with PayPal or a wire transfer. Alternatively, you can use Alibaba's built-in payment system if that's how you've been communicating with your factory. It's less common for factories to accept PayPal for your entire production run. However, for one sample payment, oftentimes they will take PayPal since the fees don't hurt them as much. The benefit of paying with a wire transfer here is that's usually how you'll be paying for their production run. So it's nice to be able to go ahead and verify their payment details now, which reduces the risk of any type of wire transfer fraud down the road. Once you receive all the samples you've ordered, you can start comparing them. The things I'd be looking for here are how quickly were they able to send you the sample? Was the communication good during this process? And then ultimately, what was the quality of the sample that you received? Keep in mind that, like I said earlier, it's likely they sent you a high quality sample. They probably buffed off any fingerprints, made sure that the one you were receiving was working well. However, you still can gauge the quality of these factories and the quality of the product based off of these samples. It's good to try to rough it up a little bit or see if there's anything that you can do to break it, or use it as your customers would to see if it's going to stand up to wear. Different types of products you're going to compare differently, but keep all those things in mind when you're comparing your different samples. It's also good to be thinking about the lowest common denominator here and just think, okay, a customer who's really unfamiliar with this, how would they think about this? Would they be able to assemble it? What wouldn't they understand? And those are all the things that you should be thinking about. After you've received your samples, I strongly recommend for you guys to add them into the supplier tracker. To do so, just click on the supplier name, the samples tab, and add a sample. Here you'll be asked to enter a sample name, what quote it's associated with, for you to rate the sample, and then it's really nice to go ahead and take pictures of the samples and upload them here. The benefit of doing this, and you'll see this down the road, is it starts to get kind of confusing which samples came from which factories. The factory names typically aren't English words that you're familiar with, so they're harder to remember. And this is just a nice place to keep all of your information about these factories right here inside of the supplier tracker. After you've added your different samples into the sample section of the supplier tracker, it's really nice to be able to see all of them here, and then you can click on the Compare All Samples button to get an in-depth, detailed view of each of these different samples. Again, once you start working with multiple factories and you're launching multiple products, it starts to get confusing, so I really encourage you guys to make sure you enter all your sample information right here inside of the supplier tracker. Let's now transition from talking about samples into negotiating on price. Now, if you would like, you can negotiate on price before you even order your sample. However, me personally, I actually like to first order my samples, receive them from the factory, check out the quality, and at that point, start to negotiate on price. The benefit of doing this is you're communicating to the factory that you are a serious seller. For me personally, it feels like I'm better able to negotiate on price at that point, and it also gives me a better idea of what kind of quality I'm working with this particular factory. As far as tips for negotiation, my top tip for you is it's always beneficial to have more than one factory that you're willing to work with. If you're only willing to work with one factory, you're not going to be able to push as hard on the negotiations because you're reliant on that factory to get this product. If there really is multiple factories that you're willing to go with, then it's easier to peg them against each other and ultimately get the best price. I'd encourage you to figure out what the maximum amount you're willing to pay is, and also be ready to walk away if they're not willing to meet that price. When you are willing to walk away and you do walk away, what I oftentimes find is that supplier reaches back out to me and says, hey, actually stop, I actually am willing to give you that price. With that being said, keep in mind that negotiating is a two-way street. If you're asking for a long list of extras or changes for the same quoted price, try and give the supplier a win as well. Maybe tell them that you don't need that extra label or that extra component or something else to help you ultimately get the price that you want. I also wouldn't recommend negotiating on pennies for an order that costs dollars. Ultimately, you don't want to start off this relationship on a bad foot. Another thing you can do in negotiating is ask for how many units you would need to order in order to get a certain price. It's common when working with factories to get a better price the more units that you order. So if you're ordering 1,000 units, you should get a better price than if you're ordering 500 units. You may also be able to commit to a certain number of units down the road or throughout the year, and as a result, get a better price. These are all the different types of things that you can be working with them on. Negotiating can be tough for some people, and you'll improve on this over time. At the end of the day, just make sure that you're not paying more than your maximum price to ensure that there's plenty of margin left over for your profit. Once you have come to a decision that both you and your supplier can agree on, it's time to pull the trigger and place that order. We'll dive into the specifics of this in the next video. In this lesson, let's talk about placing the order. It's now time for you to hand over all your hard-earned money to someone on the other side of the world you've never met. It actually sounds much scarier than it really is. I'm going to give you some of the practices to safeguard yourself against any issues happening during the transaction. Sometimes the supplier will send you an invoice after you've agreed on a price and the specifics of the order. It's okay to just pay this if you want. We recommend that you outline all the specifics of the order that you've discussed along the way, including the price, and send it to your supplier via a PO. There's actually a purchase order section inside of the supplier tracker, and we can look at that now. When you're ready to create the purchase order, click on Create a Purchase Order, fill in the information here, like your description, the quantity, the price, and then what's really nice is we've included sample agreements. Inside of the Jungle Scout Help Center, which is linked inside of the supplier tracker, you can see a sample purchase order agreement right here. I really like using a purchase order agreement like this because it makes it very clear what's expected out of the factory after you pay them your money. Now, you may be able to enforce this through the legal system in China or wherever your factory is at. But at the end of the day, are you really going to hire a lawyer there and sue them if they don't follow these? It seems like that might ultimately cost more money than what this order really costs. That being said, I still think it's very beneficial to put together an agreement like this because it makes it crystal clear what you expect out of your factory. There's a number of provisions inside of the purchase order agreement to protect you against things like your production run being delayed. I would also recommend to use this section to outline the payment terms. What's most common when working with factories, especially in China, is to do a 30% deposit upfront, then a 70% balance whenever the goods are shipped. Now, this isn't always the case. When you first start working with a factory, they might ask you to do a 50% deposit upfront, then 50% when the goods are shipped. And over time, as you develop a better relationship with the factory, you can renegotiate these payment terms. For some of my factories I've been working with for years, I'm actually able to pay them the remaining balance after the goods have already arrived at Amazon in the States. Now, it's very unlikely for a factory to give you these terms up front, but over the years after you continue to work with them, you can renegotiate better payment terms. After generating the purchase order, I would recommend you email it to the supplier and then go ahead and send them your payment. As far as paying them, what's going to be most common is to use a bank wire transfer. It's typical for banks to charge you around $30, $40, maybe $50 for this wire transfer. And something to keep in mind is you want to make sure that the transfer information is correct and you really trust your factory at this point because there's no way to get wire transfers back. Two alternatives to doing wire transfers that are less common would be PayPal or using Alibaba's trade assurance program. Now, most factories either don't accept or don't like PayPal because the fees that they have to pay are pretty high, so they oftentimes don't want to do it. Alibaba's trade assurance is getting more popular, and what's really nice about it is Alibaba gives you a certain level of protection against fraud. If the factory is requiring you to pay with Western Union, oftentimes these are a scam, and I'd recommend to run the other way. If they don't even have a bank account for you to do a wire transfer to, that would be a major red flag. Once you've made it to this point where you've paid your factory, I want to give you a huge congratulations. This is a very exciting step. I remember when I sent my first wire transfer to China to order my first product, I was both terrified because I was sending a lot of money overseas and extremely excited. To date, knock on wood, I haven't had any horror stories associated with paying companies and them running off with my money. So I don't think it's something that you have to worry about as long as you do your due diligence on these factories up front. Now that you've placed your order, it's time to start talking about inspections, which we'll cover in the next lesson. I'll see you there. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about inspections, including what they are, if you need one, and how to ultimately set them up. Now, it's